Welcome to another mini episode of Ineptus Astartes. I'm Ned, and I'm going to be continuing my coverage on just about 1,000 different aspects of the Battle for beta-garmon sourcebook, talking to you a little bit about the campaign within, all that other good stuff. I've already started covering Black Shields. I've got another Black Shields video coming out hopefully very soon. Definitely want to talk about the Solar Auxilia content. But for today, we're just going to make a brief dip into the Shattered Legions and talk about one specific thing in their design and my first thoughts on them. Now, you are not required to agree with GW about anything, honestly, that they do, and I try to be fair and open with these things as much as I can. I have to admit, this time I fully agree with something that GW themselves said in their rules. The Shattered Legions rules, unfortunately, as they are written for Heresy 2.0, do not belong in tournaments or events. Now, I know most of us aren't really considering any of what we do tournaments, but events, yes, 100%. These do not belong there. Now, Ineptus Astartes listeners, you are a small but very hearty breed of podcast supporters, and I really appreciate you. I know there's not a lot of us, but I do know that among our numbers are people who do design events and run big events, people who do stuff for Adepticon, run little pop-ups all over the place, guys at Fearx. Yeah, I'm talking directly to you here. But I really think that it is important to consider limiting these and removing them from your events. I know that it is not typically what we want to do. We don't want to have to do this, and it doesn't feel like the right thing. But for the sake of the enjoyment of the game, unfortunately, GW has put people in a position where I think it's got to be done. Now, I know many people who play Horus Heresy don't actually play that frequently at events, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, maybe less than that. If you are playing in your garage, if you are playing with just some friends or even a small campaign, you should still look to enjoy Shattered Legions. Shattered Legions as a lore concept is a really interesting narrative to mine for inspiration, and I am glad that the rules that Games Workshop has come up with have a lot of different options, and you really can get super creative in how you want to demonstrate that on the board. However, I think in their desire to make it such a unique way to play, I think they overshot and made something that is so dense and complex that it just will bog down and prevent gameplay from happening in a fun way. Now, if you have not been paying attention or you have not looked at these rules yourself, you might be confused as to what I'm talking about. Rest assured, a full review is coming in the future, but I'm trying really hard to keep this at or under 30 minutes, so I'm just going to give the broadest strokes of the way these new rules work. So the Shattered Legions detachment, it is for, the primary purpose of it really comes from what's left of the Loyalists after Istvan V, when the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and the Iron Hands are tricked into attacking the traitors of Istvan III, and then they are betrayed by the Wordbearers, Alpha Legion, Night Lords, and Iron Warriors. In the battle, Ferrus Manus is killed, Vulcan is presumed dead, Corax is gravely wounded, and all of the legions are, nearly wiped out. There are still quite a few fighting forces left throughout the galaxy, and there are several, thousands of escapees, but considering all these Loyalist legions landed with about 100,000 to start with, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of these forces end up surviving, limping out of the battle, and then, some of them go to different events in different places. They show up at beta-garmon, which is a good reason why it's in this book. They limp back to Terra. They go renegade and become Black Shields. There's a million different things that happen to them. But one of the cool things about that for us as narrative players is that the necessity that comes from forging new bonds in the face of betrayal means that you have so many cool stories that are canon lore of, the Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and the Salamanders, pockets of them, tens of them working together in small ships, and kind of finding a new way to wage war against the War Master. Now, that's the initial idea of it, but, Games Workshop is going to give us rules for us to do this with anybody, which is awesome. So if you want to play Shattered Legions with traitors, if you want to represent some war bands that weren't necessarily present at Istvan V, ended up being involved in other aspects of things, I mean, that you could even, the Shattered Legions don't have to be good guys. They can be villainous as well. It just represents a way for some of these disparate groups to connect together and play together. It sounds like fun. It should be fun. It was one of the more interesting ways to sort of do your own thing in First Edition. Now, in First Edition, there was a really simple way for this to work. You had your force organization chart for every Shattered Legion that you wanted to include as part of your force. You needed to have an HQ, a troop choice, but you all fit into the same force organization chart. You could do a couple different things as well, but they all sort of worked together. It was sort of an odd mix. You were able to blend things in different ways. There were specific rights of war designed for those Shattered Legions, and honestly, it was a great system. There were definitely drawbacks as well, but for a game that's based around narrative, it worked really, really well. Games Workshop went an entirely different direction this way, and basically made the Shattered Legions something that are entirely different from the way the standard Legiones Astartes play. You lose your Legion trait. You instead have the Shattered Legions trait, which has a whole bunch of different, admittedly cool powers and bonuses, but the application of them on the board is complicated. And that complication is going to remove some of the fun for people playing the game. Let me explain. So as opposed to the standard way of developing a list, when you play Shattered Legions, you essentially select up to 3, but no less than 2 legions that you are combining to make your force. When you then pick units or build units, like a tactical squad, for example, every unit must represent at least one model of every legion you select, at least so long as the unit has enough models to do so. So like in a squad of 10 tactical marines, if you have 3 legions, there must be at least one model from every legion represented in every single squad. If you have less than that, like, you're running a squad of tanks and there's only 2 of them, but you have 3 legions, you get to choose which ones are in there. Or if you're running a dreadnought, then that dreadnought, a 1 unit or 1 model unit, then it can be whatever you'd like to as well. Now, the numbers add up and matter because when you start looking at the size of the unit, the majority, the minority, basically the number of models that you have for each legion determines how it plays. For the example here, I'm just going to go with the classic. I've got a lot of Iron Hands, so I'm going to say we're going Iron Hands, Salamanders, and a few Raven Guard, which honestly, I could buy 20 more models and make an army like this work, theoretically, because I don't necessarily have to have that many in all my squads, but regardless. We're going with the classic 3 from Istvan 5. Now, when I designed this then, theoretically, I guess, Iron Hands is going to be the majority because that's the most models that I have, but maybe some other squads I don't necessarily want the Iron Hands to lead. Maybe more Recon Marines should be, the Raven Guard. Or maybe if I have Terminator squads, more of them survive from the Salamanders or something. So they are the leaders in that situation. At the start of every phase, I'm going to determine which of my legions has the most models, and that then presents the majority bonus that that squad gets, and the least, which has the minor benefit. So 2 rules, they're going to modify the way my squad works. And I determine that at the start of every phase. But hold on, you say, Ned. We were talking about 3 legions, and you just talked about 2 rules. That's right. If you have 3 legions, and you have 3 different legions represented in a tactical squad, the legion with the most models in that squad grants you the major bonus. The legion with the least models in that squad grants you the minor, and the one in the middle does absolutely nothing. I don't know, they're getting snacks or something. Now again, this has to be determined at every phase in the game. Well, why does that matter, you ask? Well, because models in a game die. And so every time you lose a model, you could potentially be altering the rules for how that unit plays. And considering the way reactions work, you could have the rules for that unit change 3 times in your own turn based upon what your opponent does to you. Am I being a little bit dramatic here? Perhaps, but haven't you all played games where just this very thing happens, where you have a squad that does take casualties in multiple phases of the game? Yes, 100%. It's entirely possible. Now, it's not even just that cut and simple and dry, right? Because also there are other further complications. One way to get around this is to only choose 2 legions, which I'm going to skip to the end here and tease a little bit. That is going to be one of my suggestions if people decide to allow this at events. Cap it at 2, which doesn't sound like much fun, but you'll understand a little bit why I think that. It will prevent you from having to do as much mental math or as making so many decisions in the game about which models you remove. And this is because, depending on what happens in the game, you can end up losing or changing your major, or what major is available to you, all the time. And that is just going to put more cognitive load, more thinking on the player as they are deciding which models to remove, and this is a part of the game that you don't want to necessarily slow down. Yes, players are already probably more or less thinking cautiously about which models to remove, but in a standard tactical squad, there's essentially like one person, maybe with special equipment like an augury scanner, and then a sergeant, maybe a vexilla, right? So those are 3 people who are important and everyone else is just jobbers. So like, you don't have to worry or think too much about that. In a standard game, which, and again, most of these rounds are like, what, 3 hours? With the regular amount of nonsense, baloney, whatever things you do, people walking around saying hi to other people, having to read your rules, taking these steps, which are a given in their relative speed, and then complicating them further, means that the whole game is going to be slower. No, we're still just talking about the player's intent and the way the player is going to play it. So if you have 3 different legions in your army, then you need to know 3 different subsets of rules and understand how that's going to negatively affect your game. For example, those 3 legions, which are very fluffy to put together, have rules which do maybe mesh well together in certain ways, but you could actually create some big problems for yourself if you're not careful with which models you choose to remove. So, for example, the Iron Hands have a major benefit, which, if they're the majority unit, a +1 to all wound rolls made of a shooting attack when you're shooting within 12 inches, which is awesome, right? Especially for bolters, that's really, really awesome. Their minor benefit is that each time they are shot with a shooting attack, they get a feel no pain of 5+, which is also an awesome thing. Now, of course, you can't ever have both of them in the same squad, well, most of the time and not at the same time. You could, I suppose, shoot, get shot at in return, and then on your next turn, you could benefit from that 5+ feel no pain because your majors and minors are set per phase. At whatever you have at the start is what you keep throughout. But again, you recalculate. But there's some other ones that are sort of interesting, and you can accidentally find yourself hurting yourself. So let's say, for example, you are shooting with your Iron Hands and do well, and your opponent rolls poorly against those bolters, which you've got the +1 to wound on, and you do enough wounds to harm them, and they are going to break. They're going to flee a little bit. Now, let's say, though, in the process of that, they did a return fire, and they killed some of your models. So if you're not paying attention, and you've got your Iron Hands in here, and you've got your Salamanders and your Raven Guard, right? Let's imagine that this is a veteran squad with 5 Iron Hands, 3 Salamanders, and 2 Raven Guard. Now, I say veterans right away because one of the benefits, which I do like, is that veterans and Shattered Legions gain line right away. If you take dedicated transport, they have the support role, so they can't be taken compulsory if you give them vehicles, which makes sense because they're limited resources. We like this, but veterans, you're probably going to use a fair amount of veterans if you're playing Shattered Legions. So you pop off with your bolters and whatever other weapons, because, veterans can have some upgraded weapons here, and you are close within, and you cause the wounds, and you cause your opponent to break. Now, because you're veterans, you have Relentless, and you can then charge after shooting your bolters, so you get ready to charge your opponent. Well, they did shoot you back in return fire, and you have to remove a couple of models. All right, so here's the deal. You have to kill your Salamanders, because the Salamanders, which were your middle unit before this... Actually, no, we need to do something better than this. Okay, so when talking about the different subgroupings in this army, because it's so specific, I'm going to make a ruling. Here's my ruling. I have been talking about units in multiple different ways, and I'm going to stop that. So when I'm talking about a unit, I'm going to be talking about the actual squad. And from this point on in the video, when I'm talking about the number of models that represent one legion within a unit, I'm going to talk about those as groupings, okay? So your Salamander grouping, your Raven Guard grouping, and your Iron Hands grouping, okay? I'm going to try really hard to remember to do that for the rest of this video. Feel free to point out every time I screw it up afterwards in the comments to really make me feel bad about this, because it's obnoxious, and maybe that, if nothing else, it sort of proves my point that, like, the complexity of this is whatever. I don't know. Maybe smarter people than me or people who aren't as old and stodgy don't have a problem with it like I do. But regardless, groupings is the term. Their flaw prevents them from charging or shooting at a unit that is falling back, and also they can't make sweeping advances. So in this situation, the cool narrative that you're building by being able to include all these different things, you have to be aware of the fact that in subsequent turns of the game, you can accidentally give yourself a negative effect that wasn't there at the start of the game. Now, this can just be good gameplay, right? Like, you just want to do that because you want to charge, and otherwise it seems like a pretty decent sacrifice to make. However, in the grand scheme of things, I think this is kind of lame. That in subsequent phases of the game, you can actually give yourself a pretty negative effect, and if you're not careful for it, you're really going to screw yourself up. Now, there are other examples of things like this happening already, like you shoot a unit and they take away the front row, and then now you're farther out of charge range. Like, some of this gamesmanship is already present within this game, and I do appreciate and applaud that. I don't know if having that gamesmanship built in at such a complex level of the game is a good idea for either narrative or for actual functional gameplay. There is a ton of extra opportunity for there to be some real feel-bad moments here, whether it's you as the player unintentionally screwing something up for yourself, or you as the player, like, unintentionally doing something wrong, and then you and your opponent find out later that it would have been illegal, and so then the rest of the game feels a little off. Ironically, I think making choices like this based upon gameplay as opposed to on story makes it feel more like a tournament move anyway, which is something that we don't want. At least I don't think we want in our stories and in our concept. Now, all of this has just been from the side of the player, the person who sat down with the book, intentionally designed a list, theoretically planned out or planned for some of these contingencies when deciding how many models specifically of each needed to be in every squad. But what about the person across from them, the person on the other side of the table? Now, your opponent might not know anything about the Shattered Legions, might need to be asking you tons of different questions, or be entirely confused when all of a sudden your rules change mid-game. Imagine the feel-bads that could come out of a situation where your opponent has a chance to, like, shoot 3 bolt pistols and one of them accidentally kills a squad member in a Shattered Legion, and then because of that small choice they made, they gave your opponent a chance to get an entirely different rule set, which suddenly has a dramatic and different effect on the next phase of the game, right? Would you want to win a game like that? Maybe against your buddy in your garage, because it's kind of funny. But there's potentially, like, some very sour grapes that can come about if this is something that you only ever see at, like, Adepticon or something to that effect. Even if it doesn't end up having a very negative effect on the game for you, the oppositional player, like, it still can, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it can have a negative effect on the overall fun of the game or the time that it takes. So, like, you know, I've got this squad, I've got 5 bolters, I'm trying to decide what to do with them. I look at a squad over here, let's take the exact same example again. We've got the big 3 from Mistfan 5, and I'm shooting at your squad, or I'm thinking about shooting at your squad, and now I have to do the math on how many wounds am I likely to cause, how likely are you to fail those saves, and then what are your groupings currently within that squad, and what sort of negative impacts am I going to have on myself by trying to kill one model. Without trying and failing to do some kind of, like, advanced calculus with this situation, I just want to point out that the major and minor rules for those legions include a minor boon, which gives a 5+ feel no pain for a unit that is charged in the first round of combat. That comes from the Salamanders. A 5+ feel no pain against shooting attacks from the Iron Hands, if this is a minor. And then if your minor grouping is for the Raven Guard, you get shrouded if they're more than 18 inches away, again, from shooting attacks. So there's 3 different damage mitigations, all for the minor trait, and you have to consider that that could change from phase to phase. And of course, what I'm going to do, because this is a friendly game, is I'm going to ask you about it, and you're going to tell me, because you're also a nice player, but it's going to take a while for us to explain and talk about the different combinations, possibilities, whatever else. And some variation of this discussion might need to happen almost every time that I elect a unit to shoot with. So, again, like, so slow, potentially. Maybe some of you are still mental computers. I'm not. We've all had games where things were miscommunicated. This doesn't feel so bad amongst friends usually because, you know it's not necessarily intentional. But, like, I had a game at Adepticon this year in which something was miscommunicated to me, and it ended up being a very different game because of that miscommunication. And it stunk, I didn't enjoy that feeling because I felt like the rest of my game plan was thrown off and I was doing something other than what I wanted to do, had I had known more about it. For Shattered Legions, there's so many accidental pitfalls, blind corners, and alleys in this situation where it's just not really easy to tell your opponent what's going to happen, and I just don't think that sounds like a great time. In my experience, players who are moving at a relatively quick pace through their games at a convention, while you're talking with your opponent, having a good time or whatever, if you're playing a 3-hour round, getting through 3 turns is pretty fantastic, right? If we add 10 or 15 minutes per turn in different spots, which is, I think, very, very feasible considering the fact that, again, you have to check these rules at the start of every phase, your phase or your opponent's, right? And to communicate these things, if you add 20 minutes a turn, you're adding an additional hour to a game length time, and the dream of a 3-turn game, just gone. You can probably just openly forget about that. For this reason alone, I think that we should greatly restrict Shattered Legions in events going forward because it will result in less fun for everyone involved. Now, if you still want to play Shattered Legions, or if you are an event organizer and you really don't want to totally deny a faction from your game, which I understand, here are a couple of ideas or options that I suggest. One, primarily, limit it to 2 legions instead of 3 or more. Or have people paint whatever the heck they want, but you can only claim 2 legions at most for their rules. There's even actually a little cutout in the rulebook for this, which says that models that do not have specific heraldry for a legion just count as bodies, and so neither contribute to the major or the minor. You could do something like that, okay? Doing something like this would be very clear right away. If you're going to get your rules swapped around, it would be easier for everyone involved to understand this. Now, the other thing that you could do is just realize that Games Workshop already kind of gave you a secondary workaround for this in changing something in the FAQ recently where you can have as many allied detachments as you want. So in this regard, you can actually kind of build Shattered Legions very similarly to the way that it was last edition. Now, there is a troop tax and an HQ tax for every single one of these concepts, but you get to do something very special in that regard, which is use Legion-specific troops. Because, again, that's something that's really kind of lame about Shattered Legions, which I haven't even had a chance to go into, is that Shattered Legions cannot use Legion-specific troops. Because you don't have that Legionis Astartes tag, instead of being an army with Legionis Astartes, Iron Hands, and Legionis Astartes Salamanders, you are just Shattered Legions, and then models that represent the major and minors, and then the flaws associated. In this way, you still get to keep the rules that you like, the war gear that you like from the original unit, which is great, but you can still have the feel and the narrative, most importantly, as it works. I would complain about the troop tax, but for example, I'd like to point out that in this edition, you need scoring troops so that you can stand on objectives, because so many missions involve objectives and needing to be able to park on them. And especially if they're playing some of these missions that have progressive scoring, you need to be there turn after turn after turn. So what is a tax is also probably just something that's generally important to have regardless. Is it as clean and simple as it was last edition? No. But then you don't have to worry about this complex math and this major and minor stuff. And you can use some of the same units that you were using before. You can use your cool special characters and units that, honestly, everybody loves anyway. I want to reiterate that it's not that I think that the Shattered Legions rules are unplayable. I don't even think they're necessarily bad. There's some really cool combinations within. I just think that the potential for screwing it up if you're not an expert at playing with this army, and honestly an expert at playing against it, then there's going to be a lot of confusion on the board, which won't make for the kind of experience that you want. And actually, as I sit here and finish up this whole thing, I'm reminded of, or, considering something else. I've been talking about this mini review entirely from the perspective of someone who wants their opponent to have a good time and wants the narrative to be the foremost thing, which, if you've watched this show for any length of time, you know that is my primary goal, right? However, that is not everyone's primary goal, and there are some people who believe that Heresy is meant to be played as a competitive game. Don't have time to go into that right now, but I want to point out that I think I've made a good case for why Shattered Legions can make a lot of unintentional feel-bad moments, even if you're attempting to share information with your opponent. But there are plenty of players who will not do that, who will intentionally hide this information from their opponents in order to gain a competitive edge on the table. I'm currently working as well on a Black Shield's deeper review of the different oaths and combinations, and one of the things that I said in my first video was you have to be careful not to gamify it, because it will not be as fun, in my opinion. This could potentially be just way, way worse. And so I really, really stand hard on the fact that I don't think it's a good idea for a game system that wants to be narrative. There's too many ways for bad actors, either intentionally or otherwise, to make it pretty crappy for all involved. As far as a narrative tool, this is a really unique way to play the game. It's wholly different from anything else. And different is not always good, and in this case, sometimes I think they definitely overdid it in certain regards. But it's definitely fun to think about, and it makes for a really cool additional puzzle to use. Now, I wouldn't blame any player who says they don't have the time for it, and so they just decide to stick with the basic use of the additional allied detachments or just play something else entirely, which is a bit too bad. As I said, I will be eventually posting a guide or a walkthrough on some of the different combinations that would make sense for this, but man, that's going to get really, really dense really fast. I started working on a guide for the Solar Auxilia in combinations where you have, the Solar Aux detachment that connects with the specific Legionis Astartes subtype. And that I knew right away as soon as I started working on the video was going to have to be at least 2 parts just because there's so many different combinations and ideas to talk about just for that. The combinations here dwarf that by like tenfold, at least. So it's going to be a while. If you're curious about this, though, please consider subscribing, like this video. If you agree with me, and I hope you do, about the danger of ruining a good time with the Shattered Legions, share this to your friends and get this conversation going. It doesn't have to be a downer. It doesn't have to be, like, really mean-spirited or whatever. I just think that we got to be careful with this one, or it's going to lead to a lot of not fun. I have to, of course, thank the video's sponsor, as always, hobbyogre.com, for hobby needs, supplies, paints, weathering powders, etc. Check the site out, help Dave out, and use the code Ineptus at checkout for 10% off. And, of course, I have to thank my fabulous patrons, Lone Monkey, Dark Apostle Ben, the Uptown Garage in Ankeny, Iowa, and, of course, Hobby Ogre. That's it for today. Oh man, we're going to cut it under 30 minutes. I'm so happy. Anyway, talk to you all soon. Take care of yourselves.